Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. ربنا زدنا علما. Oh Allah, increase us in knowledge, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, as we take this path, Ya Allah, increase us in knowledge, Ya Allah. Increase us in beneficial knowledge. Allow us to increase in beneficial acts, Ya Allah, and turn us towards you, Ya Allah. برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. آمين يا رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. How's everyone doing? Can I get some thumbs up? Who's ready? Nice, mashallah. Okay, awesome. So I see you guys got your notes out. That's good, try to write these things down. So just quickly, today there's not going to be a PowerPoint presentation. It's just going to be me talking. So you'll see this face in front of you guys for the next 40 minutes. So good luck. And we'll start today. The outline is just a brief introduction as who the Prophet ﷺ is. We're not going to go too much into the details. We're going to start that in the forthcoming weeks, inshallah. Today, what we're going to do is look at the beginning. Before the message of the Prophet ﷺ came, we're going to start the foundation for that. And like I said, we're going to get an overview of what the Prophet ﷺ's impact was on the world. All right. So before we start, I want to tell you guys a quick story. And this is a true story. In 1978, there was a historian by the name of Michael Hart, and he lived in New York. And think at this time, in 1978, that's over 50 years ago. People didn't have, these Apple phones. People were actually reading books. And some of these historians, they came together and said, let's compile a list of some of the most influential people in history. And they were looking for people that really changed the course of history. And so they made this book. And this book, you can find it online today, and you can even read about it on Wikipedia. It's called 100 Most Influential People in History. And what they did was they tried to look for different categories of what defines a person. So if you think and you see, okay, all of us today, we're all students. Many of us are siblings. We're also friends, sons and daughters, and they looked at these different categories, and they found 32 different categories to look at individuals. And so, for example, these categories could be being a father, being a mother, being a teacher, or even a leader. And just to cut to the chase, here's a quote from this author, Michael Hart. And he said that the greatest human being who has impacted history in all annals, which means all records of events, it has to be the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Number one. And if you guys want, some of you have your laptops out right now, just do a quick Google search and look for Michael Hart, 100 most influential people in history. And once you find that, you'll see that this person who was not a Muslim, he was not a believer, he had no personal gain in this. He was in fact a Christian, and he even stated that he would want to have had Jesus or Prophet Isa alayhi salam as the number one person on this list. But he couldn't deny the evidence. And so he said that, the only person in history who has really been successful as both a religious leader, so that means, the afterlife, and a secular leader, so political things in this world, being a diplomat, being a leader of a country. The only person who has been supremely successful in this is the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And so that's why he considered him to be the single most influential figure in Islamic history. And if you guys did that search, you'll find it. You can see it right for yourselves. Number one, it's there. And I'll just read another quote from a similar historian. just to kind of get a different mindset. And this guy's name is John Austin. He said in a little more than a year, the Prophet ﷺ became the spiritual, the nominal. So by nominal, it means like having a status, having a role, and the temporal, which means political, economic, and so on and so forth. He became the leader in all three of these categories in Medina with the potential to shake the world. With the potential to shake the world. And so 1500 years later, that's what we see. We still have Islam with us. And so just think about this for a little bit. You know, if a Christian historian who looks at the historical evidence can determine that the Prophet ﷺ is the most influential person in the world ever to exist, is it not a duty upon us to study his life and to understand who he is? Because, and I'll give you guys a question to just think about this for a little bit. Think of one person, each of you guys, everybody, think of one person that you consider, somebody who is great in history, or not even history, just somebody in today's world. Think about a great figure. You can think about music artists, actors, sports players, and just keep that one person in your mind, somebody that you can think about. And let's see, Aman, can you give me an example of one? Did you think of one?
LeBron James.
LeBron James, perfect example, right? Probably the most influential basketball player in today's world. He's played for almost 15, 18 years, and he's one of the top considered basketball players ever, with a net worth of over $1 billion. Somebody else from the sister's side, can I see Hafsa? Can you give me an example, please?
Michael Jordan.
Sorry, could you say it a little bit louder?
Michael Jordan.
Michael Jordan. Okay, another example of a basketball player, right? And I thought of some examples too. Like we have certain music artists. We've got, Harry Styles. We got BTS. And a lot of people listen to their music nowadays. But let me ask you guys a question. Do any of you guys know somebody, or do any of you guys listen to music from Nirvana? Raise your hand if you do, or if you know somebody that does. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 5, 6. What about Elvis Presley? Anybody listen to him? One person, okay. So pretty much nobody in the room listens to Elvis Presley's music. So what just about 50 years ago, Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll. He was the most famous pop singer in the entire world. And now today, just 50 years ago, I mean, that's not a long time in the general side of history. We don't listen to him anymore. His achievements, his fame, it's gone. We just remember him as a figure in history. And nowadays we listen to Drake, Mike Floss, these people. So think about this. If this person was the king of rock and roll, why don't we remember him today? Why doesn't his music live on today just as much as some of these other artists like Harry Styles, like Post Malone? And I'll compare this to the Prophet ﷺ. He was an orphan growing up in Mecca, in a desert city that was almost completely isolated from the rest of the world. And 1500 years later, we're still practicing his teachings. More than 1 billion people in this world are still practicing his teachings. So what does that tell us about who are we taking as role models? Are we really striving to learn the teachings of somebody who has permanently stayed for over 1,500 years? Or are we following some people who have a little bit of fame here and there? They make some nice music, or they have some good movies, but 50 years later, people are going to forget them. Just like we forgot Elvis Presley, Nirvana, the Beatles. Nobody even listens to Eminem either. These people were very famous. So it's one thing to think about. And I'll give you guys another story just to think about this. Many of you guys know Vincent van Gogh. He was a popular European painter. But his story is interesting because we don't understand the mental difficulty that he went through and the hardships that he faced. He, as a young man, he tried to be an apprentice to an artist. So he wanted to learn the skill of art, and his parents put him with this art teacher. and he failed. He just wasn't good at it, and he experienced a lot of heartbreak, a lot of, when you fail at something, obviously it doesn't feel good. But then he tried something else. He tried to be a Christian minister, and he failed the entrance exam. So again, he experienced struggle, failure, and disappointments over and over again, to the point where his parents wanted to put him in asylum because of how just sad he got, how mentally hurt he was. But one thing interesting is that through all the struggle that he faced, he believed that this struggle was something from God to guide him. And he believed that the struggle was sort of bringing him to his destiny. So he didn't see it as pain. He saw it as a lesson for himself. And as he continued to live, he grew through this adversity, he adapted. And now today, we know some of his paintings, and we know that he's been a very successful career. He's been a very successful artist. But the thing to remember at the outside of this is that he died very young. He never had financial success in his life. And only 100 years after his death did people recognize him as an artist. So just think about this. We know this person to be a very famous, popular artist, but throughout his life, he never fulfilled that vision that he had. He was never able to fulfill it. And now look at the Prophet ﷺ. Just a few years, maybe 8 years, 10 years of persecution, and he comes back and he fulfills his vision. Islam spreads throughout the entire Arabia. And just like I said before, we have it today. So one thing that I want you guys to keep in mind is this is who the Prophet ﷺ is. After hardship, he became a statesman, a role model for thousands, a leader, and someone with a lasting legacy. Someone that, we're so far away from him, but still we can look up to his teachings, because so much literature has been published about him, and his teachings have been preserved throughout the years. Whereas some of these leaders or some of these figures like Presley, like Van Gogh, either they've been forgotten or they were not able to achieve their success, and they're only known as, famous figures of the past. So just wanting to think about. So now let's begin at the start. The story of the Prophet ﷺ. Many of us have heard the story of Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ and the beginning of the well of Zamzam. Let's backtrack and look at this one more time and just imagine the story taking place. So the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ, he was also a messenger sent by God to portray God's teachings to people. And he tried to preach this idea to his people, to worship one God. And his people they persecuted him. They tried to put him in a fire because of what he was teaching. And his own father went against him. And they preferred to worship idols. So by the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he and his wife, Hajar alayhi salam, at that time, they traveled. And Allah told them to go to a desert land far, far away. Now just imagine you're coming from Westchester and you've been told to go and just settle yourself in North Africa, in the desert lands, where you don't see any water around. There's no markets to get food, no giants. You can't get your favorite cookies and snacks. It's just not there. There's no sign of rain. And the heat is, there's like sweltering heat that pours down upon you. That's the desert land. And Ibrahim alayhi salam was commanded to go there. And so he went there, and they settled in this valley where literally it's described as a barren valley with nothing around it, just hard sand, rock, and heat. And the command was to leave Hajar alayhi salam and the baby Ismail alayhi salam at that time, and he was told to walk away. Now imagine your parents taking you, like I said, to that desert, and they walk away from you without saying a thing. How would you feel in that moment? Think about how surprising it may be, or think about how emotionally difficult it may be to accept that. But we know that Hajar alayhi salam, she asked Prophet Ibrahim, is this a command from Allah? And he said yes. And so at that moment, she knew that Allah would take care of them. And she remained firm in her trust. And so think about this valley. It's in current day Mecca. And this valley was a known trade route. So many times caravans with camels would come and they would travel across this valley to access popular trade routes and to trade perfume, incenses, and that sort of thing. So let's look at the story of Zamzam now. Heading back to how Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was told to leave, and he left Hajj alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam in that valley alone, but with just a few provisions and nothing in sight. And so shortly thereafter, both the mother and the son were overcome by thirst. And the desert heat was still pouring down upon them. And now at this point, Ismail alayhi salam is really in pain. He's crying out loud. And at that point, Hajj alayhi salam's mother instincts kick in. And she has to do something because her baby is crying, he's in pain. It looks like he's about to die. And so Hajj alayhi salam, she runs frantically, and there's two mountains at that time. There's the mountain of Safa and there's the mountain of Marwa. And what she does is she runs up these mountains. She stands on top of the mountains and she looks across. And she looks to see if there's any help nearby. If there's any caravans coming with food, with provisions, with help. And she sees nothing. Just the barren sand, flat for miles and miles. She comes down, she passes the valley and walks up the other mountain. She runs up the other mountain. And at this point, she's still very desperate because her baby is crying out loud and he's really in pain. And she looks across this other mountain and she finds nothing. No caravan, no sign of life, no trees, just the barren sand. And she does this 7 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And nothing comes. No help. So at this point, she's really being tested. She's being tried. Because like I said at the start, that she has this trust in Allah that Allah will provide for her. And she's very desperate in the situation as well. So when she comes back, she's ran across 7 times and she's found nothing. That is when Allah sends Angel Jibreel. And he strikes the sand near Ismail alayhi salam, and water gushes forth like a spring. And that water is known today as Zamzam. And interestingly, when this water was gushing forth, it was gushing forth with such extreme abundance that Hajj alayhi salam tried to contain it. And she says, Zam, Zam. And in Arabic, that actually means to tie, to fasten. So this abundant water that kept flowing and flowing and flowing was contained in this well that is now called Zamzam. And so this is a story of how a barren land with nothing around it, no civilization and no food, became one of the most flourishing cultural cities of the world, really. And if you go to Mecca today, alhamdulillah, I've been fortunate to go there twice. And you can drink from this well of Zamzam and realize that we're taking part in a tradition that has been preserved for 1,500 years, more than that, really. So how do you know that Zamzam is really true? That the water we're drinking is actually from that well that was struck by Angel Jibreel? Well, it's the same way we know that the Quran is the word of Allah. It's through preserved oral tradition. And also, in the example of the Quran, there's manuscripts that can tell us that the Quran was documented and preserved word for word, 100% exact. So in this same manner, we know that this well and this story is true. We have it with us today. So that's the start. And eventually, as this well was created, caravans started to come by. And in the pre-modern society, the first thing that civilizations looked for was a source of water. As you guys, if you're taking history class in school, then you know that civilizations like Mesopotamia and early ancient Egypt, they were assembled along the banks of rivers and water sources, because water really is the source for life. You can use it to water plants. You need it for cleaning. You need it for sustenance for yourself. So this water well was established, and caravans started to come by, and they settled there. And slowly enough, there was a small city growing. And so fast forward to when Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam came back, and we know that this well was here. Hajar and Ismail alayhi salam were here, and a few small caravans were here that were also settled. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands Ibrahim alayhi salam to build the Kaaba, which is what we know today as that house in Mecca. And so this Kaaba is built. Ismail alayhi salam helps Ibrahim alayhi salam in building this Kaaba. And a very interesting thing that, again, we see this today as well. There's a stone. If you guys have heard of this, it's called the Hajr al-Aswad. There's a stone that is placed in the Kaaba on one of the sides. And this is said to be a stone from paradise. So when it came down to this world from Jannah, it was whiter than milk. It was almost glowing. And today it's black because as we touch it, then our sins transfer onto it. But it's just another sign that these stories are true, and you can see it for your own eyes. If you want to search it up in Google, you could even see a picture of it. But so that's the establishment of Mecca. And the last thing that we want to think about here before we move on to the life of the Prophet ﷺ is that Ibrahim alayhi salam, he made a dua here, and he said that, "Oh Allah, I've settled my offspring, my children, in a barren valley at the holy house," so at the Kaaba that we just made. "So, oh Allah, bring people's hearts to this place and provide them with provision so that they may be thankful." And along with that, he said to bring for them a prophet to recite to them your verses, to teach them, to give them wisdom and good character. And these two du'as were accepted because, as we're going to see in the story of the Prophet ﷺ, he came and he was born in Mecca, and he brought this religion of Islam to them, and he taught his companions and all those inhabitants the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, good characters, good morals. He made this society that was so backwards, like we discussed last time. People were burying their infants, people were drinking, gambling, cheating, scamming, into a society of moral uprightness, a society that contributed good, a society that spread across the Arabian Peninsula, and that made many inventions and many things that we have today, one of them being the numeric system that we use. So this was the beginning. And now let's move on to the Prophet ﷺ himself. He was born in Mecca, and for his life, he grew up as an orphan. He lost his father very early, and he was born to Amina, his mother, who also passed away shortly after, about when he was 6 years old. The Prophet ﷺ was raised in Mecca by some of his close family members, mainly his uncle, Abu Talib. As the Prophet ﷺ, he received revelation and he began preaching. He was driven out of Mecca. So think of this. You're born in Westchester, you grew up in Westchester, and this is really your hometown. You have a very good connection to it. And all of a sudden, because of your beliefs, you're told to get out of your community, you're told to get out of your city, and you have to travel somewhere else and live there permanently. And you have no idea where to go. Back in Arab society, cities were run tribally. So what we have today is statehood and nationhood, where there's peace treaties between nations. So if we have, for example, a US passport, we're free to go to different countries. But back in the Arab society, things were tribally controlled. So if you didn't have protection from a tribal member, then it was not guaranteed safety for you to travel from one place to another. So the hometown and the tribe that you were growing up in was really the safe tribe that you could live and grow and flourish and become uh, a like a person of this civilization. And so the fact that he was driven out of his hometown was even more frightening for him. So 8 years after migrating from Mecca to Medina, the Prophet ﷺ returns back, and it's like a homecoming for him. Islam now is widely accepted. It's spread across the Arabian Peninsula, and he spread righteousness, good conduct, and the teachings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala across Arabia. And he became a statesman and a leader for thousands. So now imagine going from an orphan to being persecuted, to then being a leader for thousands of people with a movement that changed society and history forever. Yet the Prophet ﷺ's character was that he still ate, drank, and dressed the same way as he was born and as he grew up, as a simple human being. And just to kind of get an idea of this, there's narrations of people who came from outside to visit the Prophet ﷺ and to see this movement growing. And they could not tell who's who between his companions. You know, nowadays, if we look at the president and if we look at some people around him, you can tell who's who. You can see that they're wearing that typical dress. They've got a people around him, supporting him, protecting him. But the Prophet ﷺ was such a simple, humble person that people from outside could not tell between his companions and the Prophet ﷺ who was who. It was as if his companions had a glow on their faces because of the Prophet ﷺ's teachings. And so it was just hard to tell who was who. And another thing is that he preferred to walk behind his companions. If you think about leaders, if you think about, you know, what we see modern days, oftentimes we see people walking in front and you've got their bodyguards around them or behind them. But the Prophet ﷺ, he wanted to walk behind his companions, and he preferred them, and he raised them and elevated them. And that was what his character was. And another thing is that oftentimes in today, if you look at the political world, we see a lot of nepotism, which is favoritism of family members. And we see a lot of oppression. And this is widespread in history amongst the rich, kings, judges. And, you know, even if you look at United States, John Adams he appointed his son as a minister to Prussia. And even Trump appointed his son-in-law and daughter to positions in the government. But the Prophet ﷺ was just and he was fair. And there's a narration that he was so fair to the point that if his daughter had stolen, he would have given her the same treatment as somebody who was just a random thief. So that was the justice the Prophet ﷺ had. Now compare these two role models. We look at the leaders of today who are corrupt, who are unfair, and who do these certain actions. And we look at the Prophet ﷺ, who was really fair, righteous, and merciful to all. And that's the role model that we're taking. And that's the role model that we're going to learn about in this class, inshallah. So that's the overview of today's class. For the last 10 minutes, we're going to look at who the Prophet ﷺ was in terms of his physical beauty. What's interesting about this is that the Prophet ﷺ had such an aura around him and such a beautiful appearance, a striking appearance, you could say, that people were not able to look at him for long. You would take a glance at him and then you would lower your head because of how striking his appearance was. So some of the narrations we have, they're descriptive, but not a lot of the companions were able to give these descriptions because it was just hard for them to look at him and to keep that glance without being so affected by his presence. And so I'll just read some narrations of this to you guys. And so the Prophet ﷺ, it's narrated that his face shone like the light of the full moon. His face shone like the bright light of the full moon underneath the dark sky. So now think of this. Put yourself in Arabia, in a city where there's no street lights, no light pollution, if you guys know what that term means. And the sky was completely dark at night. And the biggest light, the lamp that they had to shine the floor and the city around them was the moon. And one of the companions, he would look at the moon and look back to the Prophet ﷺ, and he would look at the moon again. and he'd look back at the Prophet, and he would say that the face of the Prophet is more beautiful to me than the moon. So this bright figure in the sky, this celestial body that's glowing every night, the Prophet's face was more beautiful than that. And more than this, another person described that his face was radiant, was beautiful. It was like you would have seen the sun rising. So just picture this. That's what the Prophet ﷺ looked like. And he was a person of perfect proportions. And so his face, it was neither round and corpulent, nor was it straight. It was perfect in the middle. And some other descriptions of him state that he was somebody with obvious beauty and cleanliness. And I'll give you guys another story just to continue on this topic. There was a time when the Prophet ﷺ was traveling outside of Mecca, and he approached a tent. And this tent had a family, a man and a woman, and their I think it was a she-goat that did not give milk anymore. So it was an old goat, basically. And normally this person would be like a checkpoint. You know how when we travel, for example, we go on road trips and we take rest stops. We take rest stops on the way to our destination. This was similar. So they stopped at this rest point and they asked, do you have any milk for us or any sort of provisions as we're traveling? And unfortunately at that time, they didn't have anything because their she-goat was not giving milk. So the Prophet ﷺ said, if you would allow me, I'll milk this goat. And the descriptions from this event are amazing. This person who was in the tent described the Prophet ﷺ as he was coming. And she said that he was a man with a glowing countenance, a fair appearance, without a bulging stomach. It's known that throughout the Prophet ﷺ's life, even as he got into his old age, he was fit and strong. So he never had a bulging stomach. He was somebody that was strong, skinny, and with a good physical appearance. And more so, his eyes were wide, white and black. His eyelashes were long and deep. His beard was full, and he had extremely black hair, extremely black, beautiful, long hair. When he's silent, he's stately, almost like a bold character in the room. His speech is sweet, it's clear and concise. He doesn't talk extreme, and he doesn't talk less than what is required. He was in the middle. He was of medium height, and when he spoke, his companions listened, and they had their full attention on him. So when he spoke, he garnered attention and respect from his companions. And when he commanded, he was served immediately. That was the reverence and awe that the Prophet ﷺ had. More so, he was not a scowler. So he's not somebody that, frowned at people or picked at people's faults. He was somebody that constantly smiled. He was somebody that if somebody came to him with a problem or they were upset, he would smile to them and he would make them instantly happy. And more so, he was radiant and almost like he was glowing. And so this is one of the best descriptions we have of the Prophet ﷺ. Just somebody who was of perfect stature, perfect proportions, and had this reverence and awe about him. And during this story, when he went to milk the she-goat, he milked that goat and miraculously came forth milk to fill up 2 containers. And this goat was not giving milk at all. And he filled it up double the amount of what it usually gives. And he left it with the person in the tent and he headed back. And interestingly, when he headed back, the husband of this person came back to the tent and he was amazed that this goat provided milk because he knew that the goat was barren. It didn't provide any milk. And so he asked the person, how did you get this milk? Where did it come from? And that's when the person whose name is Ma'bad, she gave this description. And that's how we know of the Prophet ﷺ today. So I hope you guys got that information. Spend some time just to think about this description of the Prophet ﷺ and really understand that he came from a very humble beginning, and he's lived a legacy that continues on today. But not only that, he was also extremely beautiful and extremely perfect as a physical human being. He was strong. He was beautiful in character, outward and inward. He was brighter than the moon. And that's part of the reason why his influence was so strong at that time. So take a moment to think about this. Make sure you guys review your notes. And that's all for today, inshallah. Thank you guys for listening. And I'll see you guys next week, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Does anyone have any questions? We can do that really quick. Anyone?
Any questions, just raise your hand. It doesn't have to be a complicated question. Anything that comes to mind. Look at your notes. If you see anything that you want to discuss or go over.
All right. I think we're good.
Let's stop the recording.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Assalamu alaikum.